cold winter months have you a bit depressed? Well, I have some spiritually uplifting news for you. Catholic Family News is going to be hosting a conference in sunny, warm Orlando, Florida, March 1st and 2nd. The theme of the conference is the global conflict between Christ's plan for peace and the devil's plan for disorder. We all sense that there is a great global conflict going on. This conference is an opportunity to step back from the details and look at the writings of an Irish priest from 100 years ago, Father Denis Fahey, who wrote about this global conflict and essentially predicted many of the things we're living through today. We have an excellent lineup of speakers, including both myself and Chris Ferrara from Church and State, as well as Father Michael McMahon, Father Matthew Panos, Mrs. Childs, Dr. Peter Kwasniewski, Mary Rundis, and Dr. John Rao. There will be a traditional Latin Mass offered publicly each day, so you won't even have to leave the hotel. For more information on the conference, please go to the website of Catholic Family News, where you can find a link to buy tickets. You can also use this QR code. Welcome to Church and State with Christopher Ferrara and Brian McCall, where we document the follies in Church and State. And we never seem to run out of material, that's for sure.
Oh, no. Impossible.
Well, I'd like to start with the church and sort of two questions. One is, what's going on with Pope Francis's health? He's been in the Gemelli Hospital for a week now. Cryptic reports coming out. Wonderful things like he ate breakfast this morning.
So I didn't tell you it was through a feeding tube.
Exactly right. So how should we treat these reports from the Vatican? What's your sense of how serious this might be?
Oh, I think they're expecting him to die, if not today or tomorrow, very soon because of his deteriorating condition. He's massively overweight. He has partial removal of a lung. He's prone to increasingly worse bronchial and pulmonary infections. This one is double pneumonia. Yeah, normally the Vatican will really downplay a Pope's condition when he's in extremis. They'll say he's doing well, and then the next day he's dead. Yeah. This time we're getting a bit more transparency. Now they're basically saying it's a complicated medical picture. So if they say it's a complicated medical picture, it looks like it could be a terminal situation. Yeah. Can't be sure, but double pneumonia in an 88-year-old guy.
With like only one functioning lung, right?
Yeah. So I would not be in the least surprised if he's on the way out, headed toward his heavenly reward, and then we have to wonder about the next conclave.
Right. Well, now I just remember when John Paul II was clearly dying. Right, the Vatican was in total denial. Oh, he's great. He got up, he had breakfast, and
that's the usual way they handle it.
Yeah. They don't admit they're seriously ill until they're dead, right?
Yeah.
But you're right. It does seem people are thinking about a conclave. There's reports the Swiss Guard are rehearsing a funeral. So,
I think that's reliable.
It seems to be. Again, maybe it's not tomorrow, but humanly speaking, we seem to be there. So humanly speaking, and we always say, look, God can do anything. He can bring something supernatural out of a conclave, but God ways are his. We can't predict what God will do, but we can use our mind and look at the human situation and kind of say, well, humanly speaking, what's this look like? So, I mean, the one thing we can certainly say is Pope Francis has had a huge effect on the College of Cardinals that will elect him. I found this little diagram from Catholic News Agency. It's 2 years old, so there's some little variation in the numbers as of today. But first you can see 63% of the cardinals have been appointed by Francis. 66% is needed, 2/3 to elect a pope. So nearly that many have been appointed by Pope Francis. Benedict is the second most. And the only other fact that's sort of interesting about this is and I actually think his DEI love may play against him. He has certainly appointed many more cardinals in certain areas of the country. First of all, Africa. He's appointed more African cardinals. We're up to 17 there. Greater number in Asia. And Europe, they don't break down, but there's been a larger number of Eastern European cardinals relative to Western European. So, with that, we clearly have the lunatics that he's appointed that there's big headlines about. But there's actually an interesting shift to areas that are seeing generally in society more conservatism. I won't say traditionalism. Let me be clear. Even if Cardinal Burke were elected, he's not a traditionalist he's probably one of the best there is, but there's nobody in there that's an Archbishop Lefebvre, right? Let's just put that on the table.
Oh, that's a given. But
Yeah,
listen, if someone like
but
Burke, as unlikely
exactly.
as it seems, were elected, he'd be the equivalent of Trump in the Catholic Church. He would definitely
Exactly.
rock the establishment to its core. He would obviously eliminate the persecution of the Latin Mass, the
Yep.
weaponization of the Vatican, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly.
Just the way Trump is eliminating the weaponization of the Justice Department. So that would be a boon, a miraculous gift if somebody like Burke were to come out of that conclave.
Burke, maybe even
Theoretically, he could come
maybe
out of the conclave as Pope.
he could. Maybe Sarah, I'd throw into that category.
Even Sarah.
Yeah, exactly. But
he's loopy too, but
look, they're all
he's not going to persecute Latin Mass traditionalists, though.
They're all infected with the disease of Vatican II. Some's immune system is fighting it off, others are totally succumbed, right? So it's all a matter of relativity. But what I think is interesting is everybody's focused on Burke, Sarah, then the crazy, Supich, the kissing cardinal, Tusho, right? They're all focused on the extremes. But if you look at the numbers, I think there's a core body of cardinals that are just your institutional company men, right? Who are, and we've seen this even in the United States, right? There's your handful zealots for suppressing the Latin Mass. Most of them are just sort of want to keep the peace, right? Just kind of don't like controversy. They're into the institution. And I think, even people he's appointed, there's a large number of those. And if they really come together and they push off the extremes, what are we likely to get then?
You never know. And the Holy Ghost doesn't determine the choice of a pope, but there's always the influence of the Holy Ghost in church proceedings. And after all, the Holy Ghost is the soul of the church. It was founded by God incarnate, and we have the promise of indefectibility. So there's always going to be that influence, that wild card influence,
right?
So that you never can entirely predict what's going to come out of a conclave. Although I have to say, Francis's arrival was pretty predictable.
Yeah.
After Benedict fled in fear of the wolves, just as he thought that he might.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, anything can happen in a conclave. You just never know. And also, manipulations can happen in a conclave. There can be deals in a conclave, illicit deals. The entire history of the church shows us that innumerable times illicit deals have resulted in the acquisition of the papacy by someone or other who turned out to be a bad pope, at least morally speaking, although we've never had a pope like this one who attacks doctrine and dogma.
Yeah.
The Borgia popes at their worst would be preferable to what we have now.
Yeah, I mean, Alexander VI tried to make his illegitimate son a cardinal, but he didn't try to say, like, illegitimacy is not a sin, go, let me bless you, right? That's a fundamental difference.
Yeah, in terms of mitigation of harm for the common good of the church as a commonwealth, I'd rather have Alexander VI.
Yeah, exactly, right. He was too busy.
That's quite a statement to make, too.
I'd rather a pope's too busy being personally immoral than wrecking the church. I agree. But again, it's what I'd like to talk about is another issue that's come up. It's funny. I was talking to somebody who doesn't believe that Francis is the Pope. I mean, he just says, I don't think he's the Pope. He's got his reasons. I don't agree with all of them. But I said to him, okay, he's about to die. What do you do now? Because again, remember that chart, 63 of these people are appointed by him. If he's not the Pope, how do you get any certainty out of the next election? Because you're not going to see the ballots and know if I exclude the 63 votes that he elected, do we have a valid Pope? So how does the state of a contest, or even a France of a contest, maybe so he's not extreme, but just has doubts about Francis, how do they get out of this box?
Well, once you embrace the state of a contest hypothesis, there's no logical stopping point.
Right.
Because of the grounds for believing that a pope has lost his office. And some of those grounds preclude the existence of an institutional church at this point.
Right.
They're saying that the ordination rite is invalid, the episcopal consecration rite is invalid. Of course, the bishops are all invalid because they embrace the same heresies as Francis, so the argument goes. So we don't have an episcopacy, or at least we don't have an episcopacy in the vast overwhelming majority, so that the conclave is going to be full of heretics who all lost their office. So how would we know that these so-called heretics could elect a valid pope? So obviously we can't go there. We are unable to establish the existence or non-existence of authority based upon an assessment of the subjective disposition of a prelate, because he hasn't been given a canonical trial. There's no opportunity to retract. You and I would get an opportunity to retract if we espoused a heresy.
Yep.
The bishop or Rome itself, if we publish something heretical or contrary to faith and morals, would demand a retraction, and we would have the opportunity to retract. These people aren't given that process because there's no one to conduct it for them, especially with the Pope. No one can judge the first see. So, we have to presume, if the promises of the indefectibility of the church mean anything, if Christ is who he says he is, that the conclave that next happens will elect a valid Pope. And if you don't believe that, then you believe the institutional church no longer exists. It's really that simple.
Well, the squared circle that sometimes I try to make is sort of have their cake and eat it too. He's not the Pope, but this conclave could produce another Pope, which again, I don't see how you can put those together. And again, not all of them are saying it's by virtue of losing his office. Some of them, I think John Henry Weston, honestly, of LifeSite, might be close to this position, thinks he was never validly elected, or Pope Benedict never validly resigned, or there was some illegality in the election.
That's a legitimate hypothesis, but the problem with the hypothesis is it cannot be confirmed unless some subsequent Pope conducts an investigation and makes a declaration to that effect. It's a legitimate concern.
It is.
But having a legitimate concern is not a conclusion.
Exactly. And again, this is why I've always been interested in the theory of the late now Bishop Tissier de Malaret. And again, I'm going to put it in different terms, but essentially he says we have to maybe understand that there may be some way for some person to keep the seat warm. Essentially, he talks about there's a sort of material occupation of the office and formal, and that essentially there could be minimally somebody who functions as Pope for the purpose of keeping the institution, the wheels on, so that you can get another Pope. And again, it was an interesting theory, and I find it more plausible than kind of some of these things that lead you to almost 2/3 of the cardinals might not be cardinals. So how do we know what comes out of it?
I think that dovetails nicely with the teaching of the church that sacraments operate ex opere operatio, so that it doesn't matter whether the one administering them is a heretic,
right,
or is immoral.
Right.
The only exception for that would be someone who positively intends to exclude what the church does with the sacrament. If he has an exactly contrary intention, that's one thing. But if he's just someone who's heretical and maybe thinks he's not heretical, and he's performing sacramental services, including confecting the Holy Eucharist, it's still valid.
Yeah.
So we have perhaps a Pope who was validly elected, is de facto heretical, but de jure remains the Pope.
Yeah. No,
it's perfectly legitimate. I mean, it's just another way of saying he's not my Pope.
Right.
In the sense that he is the Pope, but he's not my Pope because I'm not going to follow him blindly, even though he's occupying the seat. That's why I refer to him as the current occupant of the chair of Peter.
Yes.
He sits there as, for all we know, the validly elected Pope, unless it's proven otherwise by a subsequent Pope.
Yep.
But de facto, he's not the Pope in terms of what he says and does. Yep. He's an enemy of the faith in so many ways. Everyone sees that. Well, and even Babylon B is ridiculing him as a heretic.
Exactly. Well, and actually, I mean, it's interesting. He doesn't even seem to sometimes think he's the Pope. I noticed his latest screed, to the U.S. bishops on, resist Trump, essentially, become a never Trumper. He didn't even sign it Bishop of Rome, right? We've talked about he's gone from the successor of Peter, Pope, but he at least was like calling himself Bishop of Rome. This one, he literally just signed it Francis.
Well, that could indicate something, actually. Yeah. We don't really know what it indicates. Yeah. But let's remember when he came out on the loggia on the day of his election, he referred to himself exclusively, insistently, as the Bishop of Rome. Right. And said he would be the bishop of this great city. He made it clear from the beginning that he just considers himself another bishop. Unless, of course, it comes to exercising his tyrannical authority, then all of a sudden, he's the Roman pontiff. He has to refer to himself in certain contexts as the Roman pontiff when he wants to throw his weight around, which is considerable, I would add.
like trying to suppress the Latin Mass, right? Exactly. Right. Then he has universal supreme jurisdiction. But
Yes.
anyway, speaking about jurisdiction and sort of power, let's shift back to D.C. And I mean, it's been a wild month. We're just exactly yesterday, 1 month from the inauguration, and Trump is just systematically dismantling the fourth branch of government, in quotes, the deep state, the bureaucracy that's unaccountable. And it's driving Democrats crazy. So they're doing two things. They're running a public image campaign that he's this dictator, arrogating power to the presidency, stealing power and, making himself. And then two, suing him right and left for firing, trying to shrink the bureaucracy, getting rid of people that are not who will not execute his orders, trying to bring independent agencies back into the fold to actually be reporting to someone, dealing with cutting off payments of ludicrous amounts of money to send contraceptives to Gaza, apparently for like millions of dollars. So
Transgender operas.
Exactly.
Sex change operations in Guatemala.
So what's really going on here? Is he a megalomaniac who is turning the presidency into a dictatorship, or is he rescuing the federal government from an occupying power?
The latter. He's become a visionary because of what he went through during his first term and the persecution he endured for the subsequent 4 years. He's a visionary in the sense that he's ripping the scab off a festering wound, and the pus is now being exuded in massive quantities. All of these corrupt bureaucracies are bleeding out, and the Democrats are insane because their gravy train, to mix the metaphor, is coming to a screeching halt. So what they do is they can't get it through Congress this time. They can't have any fake impeachments. They can't use the FBI to conduct fake investigations of non-existent offenses, such as colluding with Russia, which was never defined, by the way, whatever the heck that means. So what are they doing now? They're running to the courts to get temporary restraining orders. And what is the essence of these temporary restraining orders? They want unelected judges to restrain the presidency. Let me tell the viewers about what a TRO is.
Yeah.
TRO obtained ex parte, meaning you go to the judge and no one else is there. The other side doesn't even get a chance to be heard. Is an extraordinary remedy among extraordinary remedies. The most you can ever get with a TRO is a 10-day temporary restraint, which could be extended. That's it. And if you get it, it's almost impossible to get what they call a mandatory injunction. A mandatory injunction is telling someone to do something, positively do something, whereas a restraint is stop doing something. Mm-hmm. Well, they managed to get an injunction compelling Trump to rehire the special counsel at whatever agency that is. His name is Dellinger. Not only compelling him to rehire the guy, which is a mandatory injunction, but compelling him to give the guy all the resources he had and allow him to keep working against Trump while Trump wants to replace the agency head. That's the most extraordinary mandatory injunction ever issued against the presidency in the history of the republic, and it was done by a TRO.
Wow.
With no participation by the other side. And now when Trump administration appealed it, the appeals court says, oh, you can't appeal a TRO because the federal rules don't allow that. You have to wait for a preliminary injunction after a hearing. So they went to the Supreme Court and they said, really? They're issuing a TRO. This judge, this activist, crazy judge, restrained the president essentially from being the president, forced him to rehire an agency head he wants to get rid of, and used the TRO to insulate herself from appellate review. So now in the Supreme Court, there's a brief saying this is a trick designed to stop the president from being the president by judicial fiat. And I just checked the Supreme Court docket. Trump administration filed a very powerful brief showing how this can't be allowed to stand. There's been an answer that I haven't read from Dellinger's attorneys and a bunch of amicus briefs submitted by the states who are in favor of this usurpation and states that are against it, including Florida. And no decision yet by the Supreme Court as of Friday, today's date, the 21st of February. So what we're seeing is this new approach. They can't use Congress, they can't use the FBI, so they're going to try to use judges to basically issue an injunction against the president being the president. Right. That's what's going on. He can't be the president. He's not allowed. He has to let the fourth branch of government continue.
Hmm. And what's your gut on where the Supreme Court, and maybe not on this particular technical issue, but on kind of all of these cases that are trying to say you can't fire people, you can't do this, you can't do that. Where do you think the Supreme Court is going to fall in terms of?
Well, he's made the issue much bigger
Yeah,
than the firing of this or that official.
yeah,
He's also issued an executive order bringing all of the so-called independent
yeah.
agencies under direct control of the executive branch, which they happen to be a part of.
Yeah.
And therefore, they should be under presidential control. You know, as Stephen Miller pointed out, the president in the constitutional scheme is the only official elected by the entire country to represent the supposed will of the people. And now, of course, we see how so-called democracy always agitates against the will of the people.
Yes.
Well, Trump is trying to turn that around by saying, listen, I was elected by the will of the people. All of these independent agencies have no right to be independent agencies. Because if they are independent agencies subject to no one's control, then we have four branches of government. So he issues this executive order saying all of the independent agencies, the EPA, the Consumer Protection Board, all of the alphabet agencies are under my control, which they always were. And he's setting that up for ultimate Supreme Court review. The Supreme Court's going to have to decide nothing less than the continued existence of the administrative state as an independent branch of government.
I mean, it's interesting. That term has always bothered me. And I've said to people, like, independent of whom?
Right.
And really the answer is everybody. They're literally a dictator unto themselves that reports to no one. And it's amazing. But how did they sell this to us? This was, liberalism, progressivism era, essentially. Max Weber basically presenting this idea that we should be governed by technocrats.
Well, here's how it works.
I mean, that's what they want. Like we want people who are technocrats, who are experts, and they know better, and they should tell us what to do. And that's sort of what they've sold. That's sort of better than any other system of government. It's really like Plato's, guardians that get to rule everything.
Yeah, well, the way it kept limping along and functioned as it did is that successive administrations were more or less able to put their own people in.
Yep.
And so the independent agencies, de facto, were really not independent. But now we're finding that those who occupy seats of authority, so-called, in these independent agencies don't want to be replaced and won't let themselves be replaced, as was the custom before. And this is all a matter of custom, by the way. It's a custom that developed outside of the law, outside of the constitutional framework, and it was tolerated. Just the way, by the way, Judge Cannon noted when she said, oh, just a minute, the special counsel was never validly appointed. It was just this custom. After the expiration of the Special Counsel Act in the 1990s, this custom arose of just willy-nilly appointing special counsels to go after people with unlimited funding, accountable to nobody. And she said, oh, well, now that I've noticed that this custom has no basis in the law, I decide that this whole prosecution is void ab initio, and she closed the case. And that decision is going to stand because the current Justice Department abandoned the appeal to the 11th Circuit. So we have a custom that developed, and that's all it is. And if the Supreme Court does the right thing, it will issue some sort of landmark decision saying that these so-called independent agencies are subject to presidential authority. They have to be. Otherwise, we no longer have a republic. We no longer have a democracy, as Stephen Miller pointed out. We have a bureaucracy.
I mean, it's essentially, where the Roman Empire went when the military and the bureaucracy picked the emperor, controlled the emperor, for a while, and did what they chose. I mean, that's sort of what they want to turn it into. And it's interesting, in their rhetoric, the Democrats, this was Biden a lot. If you listen to it, when they, quote, defended democracy, they didn't actually defend the principle of republicanism, that people who are entrusted with the public trust answer to the people at an election. They always said, we're defending the democratic institutions. It was really an interesting shift, by which they mean the mainstream media, the bureaucracies, the independent agencies, that to them, this was democracy. The actual things that are not democracy at all, or even republicanism, they're unelected dictators, essentially. And that's really what they defended by this.
Exactly. And let's give the framers of the Constitution credit where credit is due. I mean, I'm not a fan of a constitution that makes no reference to God. The founding documents of other nations throughout history always made reference to the Creator, to God. the Irish Constitution, the Mexican Constitution before the Mexican Revolution, and so forth. But nevertheless, the framework they erected within the context of a poly-professional Protestant country served as well as could be expected in given circumstances. For example, thank God for the Electoral College.
Yes.
Although Trump won the popular vote, if he hadn't, and this was a popular vote-based election, we'd have that moron as president, that cackling buffoon. So we're fortunate that the framework, to the extent that it isn't bent out of shape, does give us some level of protection.
Yes.
And by the way, this is something we should mention, which is a unique marriage of the problems in church and state. The USCCB, perfect toady of the regime, brought an action because the spigot of funding for its facilitation of human trafficking in the form of illegal immigrants was cut off by Trump. And they went before a Trump judge in the D.C. circuit. I didn't know there was one.
Exactly. I was surprised at that.
And he denied a temporary restraining order.
Yep.
And so this is a perfect example of the marriage of church and state. Kenneth Craycraft, by the way, I always mention his book, The Myth of Religious Freedom. He says that what we have in the United States is actually the most perfect marriage of church and state ever seen, in the sense that the church is totally subjugated to state power and now depends upon state power for financial subsidies, in this case in particular, so that it can continue to make huge amounts of money from human trafficking, including all the salaries of the officials in the church involved in this human trafficking of illegal immigrants. So here we see, again, the intersection of problems in the church with a problem in the state.
No, it's interesting. There's a Thomist from the early 20th century, Henri Grenier, who wrote a series of textbooks for seminarians on moral theology. And in one of them, where he deals with church and state, he really predicted this. He said, a free church and a free state is what they went for. Then they wanted a freedom of church from state. He says will result by the next century in a church subjugated to the state. And that's exactly what's happened. And how did they get them? And again, this is where they do intersect. Why are the bishops so worried about this money? Because this $50 to $100 million a year, and many from the federal government, is masking the decline of Vatican II, right? They're able to kind of hide, we've lost the people, there's no money coming in because the government is propping the church up, essentially. And that's why they're so desperate to keep the money.
Yeah, and there's nothing more emblematic of the total co-option of the hierarchy by state power than this ridiculous attempt to get a temporary restraining order against the president. And this goes to show us that this age of freedom, this is the story political modernity tells about itself. We're free now from the tyranny of popes and kings. Free, free, free. Here's a quote I'd like to share with the viewers from Jean-Baptiste Henri Dominique Lacordaire. Between the strong and the weak, between the rich and the poor, between the Lord and the slave, it is freedom which oppresses and the law which sets free. And what they're trying to do now is ignore the law so we can have our freedom, meaning the Democrats' version of freedom.
Yep.
We get all the money and we have all the power and you submit.
Yep. Essentially, we're free to...
Such as it is, the law is protecting us.
Yep.
In terms of the existing constitutional framework. And they can't live within that framework. Now, it's obvious that they can't. Now that Trump has exposed the basic problem they've created with this fourth branch of government.
Yeah. They want to be free to steal, essentially. Free to steal from the American people.
It's all theft.
Yep.
I don't believe taxation per se is theft, and
No.
Church teaches you should pay just taxes. But taxation poured into the coffers of this government turns very quickly into theft on a massive scale. And that's what Doge is exposing.
Yes, absolutely. Well, there you have it. Maybe by the next time we get together, we'll be in the midst of a conclave. Who knows? Only God knows. Francis will be called to his, I'll say, eternal judgment rather than reward at this point. We'll see.
We're all sinners.
Yep.
And he has the means to repent of any sins he might have committed. Even we're not judging his subjective disposition, but no one is in better position to have a deathbed conversion than a pope, for heaven's sake.
Certainly.
So we can hope the best for Francis. And in the end, from the eternal perspective, we should look forward to a time when, if Francis repents, we're all together in heaven, and we embrace him and he embraces us. That's what it's all about, ultimately.
Absolutely. So pray for him in this hour that he does die in a state of grace, and we'll see where the world goes. All right. Well, thanks for your
Until the
thoughts.
next time,
Till next time. See you then.
God bless.